put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Thomas wanted proof. Thomas is a perfect symbol for the 20th and 21st century mind. I'm intrigued, actually, about how it was that Thomas became the poster disciple for doubt. Because, the rest of the bunch didn't acquit themselves so well in the faith department. When you read through the resurrection accounts in all four Gospels, you quickly realize that Thomas was not alone in doubting. Indeed, in the resurrection stories, doubt isn't the exception, doubt is the rule. When the women first reported that Jesus had risen, did any of the disciples simply believe because the women said so? Yeah, did any of them fall on your knees proclaiming, "Oh yes, it's true, we believe you"? No, not at all. What did they do? They ran for themselves to see if the tomb really was empty. And even upon seeing that themselves, did they believe? No, not at all. What did they do? They locked themselves away in a room, hiding and cowering in fear and doubt, afraid that they might be accused of stealing Jesus' dead body. As we learn from today's reading, it wasn't until Jesus personally appeared to them later on Easter evening, behind their locked doors, that they came to believe that Jesus lived. So no, Thomas wasn't the only one who needed to see before he believed. And we shouldn't chastise Thomas for asking for the same evidence the other disciples got. No, Thomas wasn't the only one to doubt. Thomas, however, was the only one honest enough to openly admit his doubt and to admit he would only believe when he saw it himself. We have to admire his uncompromising honesty. It takes a lot of courage to speak up like that, to just not go along with what the others are saying. And so I propose we should think of Thomas not as the doubter, but rather as honest Thomas. Honest and courageous Thomas. We should honor his honesty, his forthrightness, and yes, his integrity. And we should strive to be more like him. And we should honor his courage, because it really does take tremendous courage to speak your truth in the way that Thomas did. It's much easier to just go along, to pretend, to be part of the crowd, to not rock the boat, even when we don't believe what the others are saying or doing. In this way, too, Thomas could serve as a model for us. There's still another reason I think Thomas is courageous. Today's reading states that Thomas was not with the others in the locked room on that Easter evening. Where was he? What took him away from the community that evening? We don't know because we aren't told. We're only told he wasn't there. But what seems true about his absence that evening is that Thomas refused to surrender to the crippling fear that kept the other disciples cloistered and trembling behind closed doors. Thomas was the only disciple courageous enough to venture out, even if he may have had doubts and fears. We're also told that Thomas made it back to the group that evening. Imagine what that would have been like. "Hey, Thomas, guess who showed up while you were gone?" The disciples expected Thomas to believe simply because the disciples claimed they have seen Jesus. Let's be honest with ourselves, like Thomas was honest with himself. Would that have been enough for you? Would you have believed the disciples if they told you that Jesus suddenly appeared in their locked rooms to show them his wounds? Wouldn't you too have demanded the same evidence the other disciples got? The opportunity to experience for yourself the risen Christ? Thomas was quite clear what he needed to believe. He needed exactly what the others had already gotten. In his honest and his forthright manner, Thomas clearly stated his doubt and clearly identified what it was he needed to believe. And then he waited. And then he had to wait. Would he get the same chance to experience personally the risen Lord? 8 days passed. That may not sound a long time to us, but I'm sure it was a long time to Thomas. A long time to be the only one left out of the experience. A long time to be the only one without the evidence that all the other disciples had gotten. Had he been forgotten by Jesus? Would he ever experience what the other disciples had experienced? But notice something implicit in the story. Thomas didn't give up. He didn't leave the group in a petulant hissy fit for having been left out of the miraculous event. Thomas continued to show up, doubts and all. He didn't leave the community, but continued to meet with them. He stuck with them, waiting. Again, Thomas shows courage. The courage to return to face a community that had had an experience that he didn't share, and the continued courage to continue to insist on his own experience of God. So maybe we should add to our new list of names the title also of Faithful Thomas, the faithful disciple who, notwithstanding his doubts, his questions, his indecision, kept showing up. It was one of those times when Thomas showed up, doubts and all, that Jesus showed up again. And Thomas, in fact, had his experience of the risen Christ. And isn't that how it's often been for us too? That it is in community that we personally experience God? If we look at Thomas's story with fresh eyes, we see something quite wonderful in the interaction between Jesus and Thomas. Jesus does not speak words of condemnation or accusation or disappointment toward Thomas. He does not rebuke Thomas for questioning or doubting or wanting to see the nail marks and the wounds. Thomas had expressed an honest and heartfelt need, and Jesus graciously responds to that need. He invites Thomas to look if he wants to. He invites Thomas to touch if he wants to. And he greets Thomas with words of peace. Peace be with you. Do not be troubled. Do not be afraid. No peace. Not words of accusation, condemnation, or disappointment, but words of blessing and grace. Jesus comes to Thomas in his doubt, meets Thomas where Thomas is, and offers him peace. And in that moment of loving care, Thomas knows he has experienced God. My Lord and my God, he proclaims. Simple, yet profound words. The beauty in this story is the love that Jesus shows for Thomas, even in his doubt. By his compassion for Thomas, Jesus acknowledges that deep faith requires perseverance. It requires attention to both the head and the heart, and it takes time. Notice, too, something curious. The text doesn't tell us whether Thomas ended up actually touching Jesus' wounds. The silence in the text suggests Thomas didn't. So, as the story comes down to us, Thomas doesn't end up needing the proof he was so sure he required. And sometimes that's the same for us too, isn't it? We're convinced we need to experience God in a certain way to really believe and to have our doubts banished. We need something striking, something dramatic, something akin to thrusting our hand into Jesus' wounded side. And yet, isn't it often true that our truest and realist experiences of God come more often in quiet and still moments, moments that can move us to quiet tears, in the tender, caring words of another, in being accepted by others for who we are, with all our faults and all our shortcomings, or in quiet contemplation of a blazing sunset, or in that moment or event, whatever it is, that we can't explain, that we don't expect, that we don't deserve, to which we can only respond, "My Lord and my God," knowing in our hearts, for that moment at least, that we have experienced God in our life. Thomas is often pointed to as the icon for the latter church, that is, the second or third, or like us, the umpteenth generation of Christians who have inherited the stories of the risen Christ, but who must, at some point, insist on their own experience of the risen one. In this sense, too, Thomas becomes for us not a symbol of faithlessness, but a lesson in courage and honesty and faithfulness. For us here, now, in the 21st century, the story of Thomas teaches us that God accepts and honors our questions, will not rebuke or punish or condemn us if we question or if we doubt. We're taught that it's fine to trust what others have told us, but there's also nothing wrong in our own searching. We can search, we can question, we can disbelieve. We can desire our own encounter with the Word made flesh. We can yearn to really know for ourselves whether God exists, whether Christ is risen, whether there is a meaning and a purpose in life. It's all okay. God doesn't need us to believe certain things, but will come to us wherever we are, offering us peace, offering us reconciliation. Our doubts, our questions do not keep God away. Honest, courageous, and faithful Thomas also teaches us to keep showing up despite our doubts and questions. We also learn through Thomas's story that we, as a gathered community, must create a safe place for all of us to honestly express our doubts and our questions. And we must create a communal life that welcomes all, regardless of where they may be or not be on a faith journey. And through Thomas's example, we can trust that indeed there are no doubts so deep or so profound that God cannot break through our locked door, our hardened heart, our limited vision. And also here now, in this time and place, the story of Thomas teaches us that waiting, like questioning, is a part of the faith journey. Sometimes we wait for a specific answer or experience, only to learn that we don't really need it at all. For God can come to us in ways we don't expect and in ways we can't even imagine. The story also shows us that God bothers enough, that cares enough to show up a second time, a third time, an umpteenth time to breathe life on us, to grant us a living experience of God. We may have to wait. We may never have the defining experience. But even in the midst of our questioning and doubts and searching and waiting, we are invited to know peace. Our doubts ultimately may be assuaged or they may not. It really doesn't matter. The point is that being faithful resurrection people isn't having no doubts, but living with them in peace. It's a great comfort, isn't it, to learn that even the first disciples and the first followers of Jesus, those who purportedly had firsthand experiences of the risen Christ, also struggled with doubt. It frees us, doesn't it, to question, to be honest with ourselves and with each other and with God. Our questions are sacred. And questions end with our questions and our doubts and with all. We are invited to live in peace. Peace be with us all. Amen.